Tatum and Brown have been here forever. Derek's been part of these teams now for 3 years. I don't think it's invalid. Al, of course, is, he spent some time elsewhere, but he's been on a bunch of these teams. The point that I always make, though, is this team is so different, right? And particularly if, as we assume, Kristaps Porzingis is back in the NBA Finals. Derek White is a different player this year. Drew Holiday is sort of a Swiss Army knife that has done everything that he's been asked of. Hey, you got Halliburton on you. Go score. Great. I can go score. Hey, we need you to guard Embiid. Go do that. Get offensive rebounds, make defensive plays like he did at the end of game 3. Like, he just does whatever. And so you can talk about the past, but I have a real problem with not at least acknowledging how different this team, how much better Joe Mazzulla has been this year as a coach and his comfort level. It's like, yeah, that's fine if we want to talk about the emotional hangover, but if we want to talk about basketball, this is a different team.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the Drew Holiday piece of this is ridiculous. That, you look at Brad Stevens run through this and it goes, okay, you're going to have a really good team. So the draft pick's probably not going to be that great. It's like, so wait, San Antonio wants to get into the Derek White business of like moving him. Okay, done. Like, it may be boring for the front office and not worrying about the draft pick and having to scout extra hard before the draft. But these are the kind of transactions where you think like, that's a no brainer. The Drew Holiday one to be like, okay, now you're going to flip the Brogdon deal into that. And Rob Williams was just never felt healthy. Even when he was healthy, it was like he wasn't healthy. And then you somehow end up with Drew, which I'm sure Milwaukee was like, wait, what happened? Like, I'm sure, I still think the Bucks would have done any deal that involved them getting Dame and raising their ceiling potentially with the talent like Dame. And then Porzingis, where I had no issue with them moving on from Smart. I thought in 22 it was like the best Smart had played, but I'd also watched enough of it to see that Smart had moments where he kind of felt like he was the guy because he was the emotional leader, but that they could have replaced that with just somebody else who understood the role a little bit better. And Smart probably understood it best when they went to the finals in 22. So being fair to him, but like Drew, day one, is like, okay, I'm the sacrifice guy. Unfortunately for like Ray Allen when he came in 08, like he was the one that sacrificed the most. But with Drew, it's like, okay, I already know what I'm going to do. I may have my moments where I'm going to be hitting some of these shots. And so then when you figure it out with the final Porzingis thing, he was so good last year. He changes who you can be on offense, especially if you want to start looking ahead of the Dallas matchup of a big that's actually going to pull Gafford or Lively away, and then maybe challenge Dallas in a way that they haven't been challenged at all against Minnesota, because Rudy, like if you stretch, it just means that you're just going to ignore him. So you're not really changing your defensive alignment all that much. So you're right. They have more options. They're better. They're the best team of this entire group. It's not debatable. But I think where they get into trouble is when you look at like the historical comparisons of the 16 Warriors net rating. And you're like, well, they're not those guys. Or the second three-peat Bulls, where you're like, well, that's not true. Or the early 70s Milwaukee Bucks. Like, their profile tells you they're one of those teams. And yet I will, as somebody who's watched this team throughout the entire season, have these moments where I'm like, tie ball game, minute left. Is Tatum going to hold it in the triple threat for 20 seconds with no one cutting and no passes whatsoever? And his talent and his size tells him that's a good shot. But it just becomes really easy to defend because nobody else really has to move or anticipate any other stuff, because they'll stop moving. They will stop in those moments offensively. And that's the part that I think drives Celtics fans crazy, and why, despite those numbers and agreeing with you that the entire sum of this is better than any of these other versions, they've had this awesome record, these dominant wins, and yet we still have these moments you're like, I'm not going to trust any of those guys as much as Luka with the ball with a minute left.
But how much of this discourse is just the overall Tatum disrespect and people being, I mean, you're seeing it. We saw it after game 4. It's like people are saying, oh, he's not happy enough for Jaylen Brown. Like they zoom in on his face and like, he's not smiling enough. There seems like for whatever
not
reason.
A smiler. I'm not a smiler.
Like he's a guy, like we've had him on the show a bunch. He's a great podcast guest, but he seems like a guy that like he lets his work do the talking and he doesn't need to be front and center all the time. And I wonder if that hurts him a little bit in terms of like his resume, like you just mentioned, speaks for itself from when he came into the league to what he's accomplished since then. He's never missed a playoff game. He's playing 100-day playoff games at this point. Like, how much of this is just like Tatum disrespect?
The Tatum part of this always feels like it's easy for me, which makes it complicated in the way we talk about him, because he's never going to be the best player in the league. He's maybe going to flirt with number 5. Okay. He made all NBA first team this year. He should have. I voted him for that. Like, I thought that was pretty easy to go ahead and make that move to put him on first team. But he's never going to be the best player. So you're going to be kind of pining for like, oh, is he ever going to be one of those guys? And maybe there was a time you thought that could potentially happen. But as great as he is, I don't think he is. Like, he's not Jokic. He's not Luka. He's not Giannis. I'm not even sure if he's SGA. So that in itself becomes like this entitlement thing where you become frustrated that he's not going to be one of those guys. But he also isn't like extremely disappointing. So you can't really dog him. So I think it should be simple, because that's where he is. Those are the bookends. He's going to be top 10 for a really long time. But because the top 5 guys seem to dictate the titles every single year, I think that becomes part of the frustration. I also think his demeanor with all this nonsense after the Jaylen Brown thing. And by the way, I think Tatum should have won Eastern Conference Finals MVP. Maybe I wasn't shocked because Jaylen Brown had the 2 moments. But I just think as far as like which player is dictating what's going on more and which player is dealing with more and dealing with the tougher defensive assignments, I was a little disappointed to see the voting go that way, but I wasn't as outraged as, say, 2015 with the NBA Finals when Iguodala got it over Curry. But I just think the voters have a harder time with that stuff. But Tatum is the face of a franchise where, the dumb way we look at this stuff, whereas like Jordan's better off, not losing the finals is great, but LeBron losing in the finals and not losing the Eastern Conference Finals is somehow seem worse. Like if Jordan had losses outside of the finals, that's better on the overall resume because he gets to say 6-0. Where like I wonder sometimes with Tatum and Brown if they had been better off never getting to the Eastern Conference Finals as many times, like having their only 2 Eastern Conference Finals appearances be in 22 and then in 24. It reminds me a bit of Ohio State, like back 15 years ago when Ohio State gets blasted by Florida and LSU, and everybody's making fun of Ohio State, and they're going, well, wait, like we're at least making it to the national championship game, and some of you guys can't even win 7 games, and you're making fun of us. Like, what's the point? So the stakes and the attention, as we all know, raise the deeper they go into this. And these guys have been going so deep, and they play all the time in a league where we're like, hey, how many games is that guy going to play? Is that a good contract? Is that guy going to shut it down? Is that guy even going to be healthy? These dudes play all the time. So I'm personally like, hey, I know who he is. I know what his ceiling is, and that's awesome. You should be thrilled you have him, but it does feel like it's more negative around him than it should be.
Yes. And I think this is the case with several players where pundits want them to be the number 1 or the number 2 guy in the league.